Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Do you want to mention our Words and Numbers get-together in Arlington on November 9? You're going to be there, aren't you?
I am.
A few Words and Numbers listeners are getting together in Arlington on November 9th. And if you're in the area and interested, drop us an email. I'll send you the address. It's nothing formal, just a few people. But that brings up my topic, because a few of our listeners, several of them, have written us saying, what's the deal with former President Trump saying that if he's elected, he would replace the income tax with tariffs on imports? And is this possible? Would it be good for the economy? That sort of thing.
You know, once again, showing his bear-like grip on his knowledge of economics.
And politics. This is not within the purview of the president. I mean, he can certainly push for it, but taxes are Congress's purview.
Let's take a giant deep breath and say his understanding of politics might be pretty good here, because he's saying, I'm going to do away with the income tax.
Right, yeah. So in terms of getting him elected, yeah.
Just because he can't do that doesn't mean it's bad politics.
Right. But nonetheless, from a practical perspective, if he did intend to actually do this, that's within the purview of Congress. Now, I think he bumps up against a bigger obstacle, and that's possibly the laws of mathematics. I was just running some back-of-the-envelope calculations here. Currently, the federal government collects $5 trillion in revenue. That's all sources combined. So everything the federal government collects, put it all in one pot. It's $5 trillion a year. Of that, about 2/3 come from income taxes. Most of that is personal income tax, and then a small piece is corporate income tax. But put all that together, you're around 2/3. So let's call it $3 trillion the government collects from income taxes that he's going to shift over to tariffs. Here's the problem. The U.S. imports about $1 trillion worth of goods and services per year, which means if he wants to collect the $3 trillion that we're now not going to be collecting from income tax, if he wants to collect that from tariffs, he would have to impose a 300% tariff on average on everything that comes into the country. Now, there's a huge footnote that goes there.
Yes, there is.
And that huge footnote is with a 300% tariff. So that's the tariff on top of the price of the object. So the object is, whatever it is you're importing, is now quadruple. It's 4 times as expensive as it was before. What's going to happen? People are going to cut back substantially on imports, which means that 300% tariff needs to be much more than 300%, because we're not importing $1 trillion worth of stuff. We're importing much less.
It needs to be 1,000%. The higher it gets, the higher it must go.
Exactly. And here's where I say he may be bumping up against the laws of mathematics. It may be actually impossible to raise $3 trillion via tariff, because before you ever get to the $3 trillion mark, your tariffs are so high that you shut off imports completely, and there's nothing left to tax.
And let's keep in mind that this is only to maintain the current situation, which has a budget wildly out of balance already. So everything gets worse.
So if he were to say he's going to do away with the personal income tax, corporate income tax, and replace it with unicorns and rainbows, that statement would be actually on par in terms of believability with his current statement of he's going to replace it with tariffs.
That's right. It would be, roughly speaking, the same.
Right.
Because neither of those things is ever going to happen. We still get his supporters trumpeting this nonsense across social media as if it were actually possible.
So anyway, that's my quick hit for the day, and I throw up my hands and say, when will the adults, A, start running for office, and B, actually be the people who are voting?
I can answer that question for you. Can't answer most of the others, but this one I can answer. And under current circumstances, the correct answers to your 2 questions. Question number 1, never. And question number 2, never.
Yeah, and in opposite direction. The first answer is you'll never get adults running for office so long as we don't have adults voting.
And you can pretty much bet that you're going to maintain both of these things in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Perhaps related, we have Jeff Bezos, who we really haven't talked about for quite a long time, given that he no longer does much by way of running Amazon, right? He just kind of sits there and minds his own business with all of his billions and his ex-wife and tries to figure out, hey, how best to live under those terrifying circumstances. But here he is back in the news today because a company that he owns, the Washington Post, refused to endorse Kamala Harris.
I saw that. Did they refuse to endorse Harris, or did they refuse to endorse anyone?
They didn't endorse anyone, but really...
Right, given their track record, that's not endorsing Harris, yeah.
That's right, they refused to endorse Harris, and the haters came out almost immediately and said, well, clearly Jeff Bezos is terrified of the possibility of a Donald Trump presidency, during which Trump would get even with the Washington Post by doing whatever horrible thing he's promised to do to the First Amendment and the free and independent press. And those things are legion, for they are many. But it wasn't really Jeff Bezos's call, right? There's an editor at the Washington Post who stepped up immediately and said, this was my call. I did this.
Right.
A bunch of people at the Post, a bunch of writers, they did what writers do, and they wrote up some sort of letter condemning him in the most hostile of terms for the horrible thing that he had done or not done, and here you go. But when did we get to the point where it was just an expectation that every newspaper in the United States would endorse a Democratic candidate?
I've never liked the idea of them endorsing anybody.
That's exactly the second question. When did we decide it was a great idea to have newspapers endorsing anyone at all?
Did you see what Reason Magazine did?
I only know they did what they always do. They put out an issue telling everybody how they individually voted.
Right. Yeah, I didn't realize they did this, but they polled their workers, their employees, and they have a back and forth, not just who are you endorsing, but why do you intend to vote for this person? Which, if you're going to do anything, that seems more fair in some sense.
I guess. Should I be making that declaration that my daughter works for them?
Yeah, well, yeah, why not? I mean, she's a smart person. And the people over there seem to be reasonable.
Kinda. Should we be telling our listeners who we're voting for?
No, I have no desire to tell listeners who I voted for. But
So let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. You just said that it was the smart thing to do not to have an endorsement, but to have the various employees tell how they're voting and why. No. And the minute you were offered the opportunity to tell the people how you voted and why, you packed up, closed the door, and walked back in and had your cup of coffee.
Not at all. My preference is that media entities not endorse anybody. But if you're going to say anything, do something like Reason did. Rather than the paper coming out in favor of one or the other, let the individual employees say something, if anybody's going to say anything at all.
So because we seem, you and I, the Words and Numbers family says, because we seem to hate all politicians with an almost equal fervor, well, that's good enough.
You said something a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember whether I mentioned it last episode, but it really got me thinking, and I posted something about it on Facebook, that if you live in a state that is clearly going to go one way or the other, you're wasting your vote voting for anyone other than a third-party candidate. Not that the third-party candidate has any chance of winning this time, but the more votes the third-party candidate gets, the greater the probability that we'll have a third party on the debate stage next election cycle.
Yeah, and sometime in the indeterminate future, at least, right? And I'm not crazy enough to think this happens in one more election cycle, but, you know, if you're in Utah and you're a Republican, there's no point.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like that's not going to happen.
Yeah, or if you're a Democrat, there's no point. Utah's going to go one direction.
Conversely, the state of California very likely locked up pretty tight. How do I know this? Because 8 seconds after the polls close, they're going to call it for Kamala Harris.
Right.
And they're going to be right. Now, if you're in Nevada or my beloved state of Arizona or Pennsylvania or any number of other states, probably 7 or 8 of them, well, that's not true for you. and vote accordingly. But for most of the people in most of the United States, their states are already decided.
So the most effect you can have on the electoral process at this point, if you're in one of those states, is to vote for a third-party candidate.
That's how people will care for your vote the most.
Right, yes, yeah.
I leave it at that. This, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And how could you get more foolish than any of this?
I'm sure you found something.
Well, kinda, because there's this Marine veteran, and we don't talk about veterans affairs much. It's not in our wheelhouse. But her name is Katherine Banks, and she was going to visit her sister flying Delta, the airline I used to fly when I lived in Utah and loved so very much. And she was getting on the airplane in somewhere in California. It was San Francisco. It was at San Francisco International. And she had a T-shirt on that said the following, which was in service to a group that she was very much involved with. And it said, "Do not give in to the war within, end veteran suicide."
End veteran suicide, yeah.
And she was plucked off the plane by a flight attendant and told she could not get back on the plane until she took her shirt off because it was threatening.
The shirt was, she's calling for the absence of violence, and her shirt is threatening.
You have it exactly right. So
what the hell is wrong with Delta?
What the hell is wrong with everybody is the better question, because I've been watching America lurch to a position where every single thing is threatening to everybody all the time. People whine about being triggered, and then they whine about being threatened, and they whine about feeling unsafe. I've got one simple thing to say. Put your big boy pants on and get about your business and leave everybody else alone. How hard is that? When did that become anything other than the default position of America? We used to wake up every morning and think, well, that's how you do it.
Yep.
And here we are. We're all precious snowflakes now. Everybody has a claim on the behavior of their neighbors now.
Did Delta Corporate have any response to this?
They say that they've worked it out with the woman in question. I'd like to see them explain to me, if not to anyone else, how it is a shirt that says "end veteran suicide" is somehow threatening in their eyes, and what their appropriate action was with the flight attendant who dragged this woman off the plane.
Yep.
Was that person terminated? If not, why not? I'd like to hear the answers to those questions. Perhaps we can email this link to Delta's PR firm and they could get back to us.
Well, I'm sure what didn't happen is that the employee did not get any additional education in diversity, inclusion, and all that nonsense, which is what would have happened if the employee had thrown somebody off with some shirt that had
with an anti-Kamala Harris message, perhaps.
Sure.
And it occurred to me the other day that, in the foolishness of the week, we pick on Donald Trump a lot, primarily because he makes it just so easy. But there's a lot of foolishness going around this time of year, and it tends to permeate. It's not just one side or the other. The Democrats have been particularly ridiculous throughout this election cycle, and we haven't called them on it because, frankly, Donald Trump has been more ridiculous.
Right.
Hey, maybe we'll talk about that as we continue on today.
Before we leave the topic, there's something tangentially comes to mind, and that is, no matter who wins this election, there are going to be a bunch of Americans on one side or the other saying, this is not my president. And I think prior to the election, particularly given that it's so close, this is a good time to say, none of you should be doing this, no matter who you are, no matter who you voted for. The whole point of living in a democratic society is that this is how we work out our disagreements peacefully. And sometimes you get the guy that you wanted, sometimes you don't. But part of living peacefully is saying, okay, if I didn't vote for him, he's still my president because that's what came out of the process.
But look at who they're taking their cues from. We have a presidential candidate who refuses to accept that he lost an election 4 years ago. When that happens, well, none of his followers are going to accept it either. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, people on the other side are going to take a lesson and they're going to start behaving in pretty much the same way. People say that they don't see how Trump is a threat to democracy. Well, the peaceful transition of power is very important.
Yeah.
They forget that the United States in the year 1801, was the first country that had a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another.
Mm-hmm.
And that only works if the party that held power looks at an election and says, well, I guess we lost. See you in 4 years. We'll try again. Unless that happens, you're doomed.
If anybody in modern times has anywhere close to a legitimate complaint that the election was stolen,
It was Al Gore.
Al Gore. And I'm not making a claim one way or the other. I'm just saying there was so much irregularity, and the Supreme Court got involved in all sorts of questions about whether you count this or whether you count that. He had a much greater claim that the election was stolen than did Donald Trump. And yet what did he do for the good of the country? He said, I concede. George Bush is president. And that was it. There was no further question.
There was no further question, but there was already too much question. Because I remember teaching at the time at Utah State University, saying in various American politics classes that there was literally no way Al Gore could win.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was arrayed against him. Every avenue he could walk had a roadblock in it. So there was literally no way he could. Above and beyond that, he had very probably lost. Right? It was very probable that the right decision had been landed on. Having said that, the right thing for him to do was to stop long before it ever became an issue, to stop pressing the matter. And he did not do that.
Mm-hmm.
I said at the time, a better man would have conceded much earlier. And what do we see now? A worse man conceding not at all.
Yep.
And that's a real problem. People say, well, why is it a real problem? Because in the end, every government, but especially one like ours, rests on opinion. And when the opinion is no longer, this is a good and useful and true way to govern, it won't be the way we govern anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think the Constitution is worth saving, and we've been at war with it since the early progressive times, then you should be playing by the rules, no matter how much harder that makes your job. And if you don't, you're going to get, I think, a really rude awakening. If you look at what we're doing right now, if you look at the election between Trump and Kamala Harris, I think that's proof enough that we fell asleep at the switch. Because earlier I jokingly said, should we tell the people who we're voting for? You said, good God, no. All right, why would you say that? And then why would I say what I said? Well, I said what I said because I have no idea who I should vote for. I think they're both incredibly dangerous people. Right? I think on the one hand, you've got Trump, and he strikes at the very heart of the legitimacy of government. Then you've got Kamala, who I think, if you strip everything away, is more or less sympathetic to Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
The ridiculous things that she says, her weird slogans, are right from the Karl Marx playbook.
Mm-hmm.
She's not smart enough not to say those things, and she's not terribly bright. And everybody kind of knows this. This is the worst kept secret in all of Washington, D.C., is that Kamala Harris is kind of stupid. She's also extraordinarily difficult to work with. Everybody who was under her during her time as vice president, 3/4 of them quit because they just couldn't take it. All right, congratulations. Those are your two choices. How's that looking for you? One, Trump, who says, I'll get even with all of my political enemies. We'll punish them all. We'll get them good. And then Kamala Harris saying, we're going to give everything to everybody all the time. And if you want to buy a house here, take this. And if you want an education here. And government's really just about redistributing wealth.
Yep.
Well, neither one of those things is a particularly intelligent way to go about your business. And if you're looking for two options that strike to the heart of self-government, there they are. And yet we all line up and say, if you don't vote for this person, you're wasting your vote, and the other person is so evil that we can't. Well, how many years are you going to do this? Mm-hmm. And have it be wrong and say it anyway? We've been here for years pointing this out, and everybody just keeps right on rolling.
And here's where the importance of getting a third-party candidate on the stage is. And I don't care what the third party is, libertarian, green, I don't care. Get a third person on that stage. And that's going to make the other two parties straighten up quite a bit, because all of a sudden they'll face the real possibility that neither one of them will win.
Right, but as we've pointed out time and time again, and many of our guests have pointed out time and again, who controls who gets on that stage? Democrats and Republicans. Therefore, who's allowed on the stage? Democrats and Republicans.
Unless an overwhelming number of Americans start voting for third parties. If you're a skeptic, the place to do that safely is if you are living in a state that is already going to one of the major candidates. It doesn't matter whether you vote Democrat or Republican in that state, your vote will not matter. But it will matter if you vote for the third party.
I think that's ultimately right. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, it's not.
We're not inclined to care about these things. We're not inclined to pay that kind of attention to these sorts of issues.
What happens is we think emotionally. I posted that argument I just laid out for you. I put it on Facebook. And immediately people started saying, well, I live in a state that's all Republican and I'm voting for Trump because I believe in him, blah, blah, blah. Completely missing the logic I just laid out. And the person is responding as if I impugned his favorite football team.
You see the problem here. You use the word logic.
Yeah.
We have always expected too much of voters. Voters don't expect that much of themselves. Whatever voters expect of themselves, that's what you can expect of them. And in our 250 odd years of history, we have moved towards more democratic mechanisms over time. And it's been a mistake every time. We should be less democratic, not more. How do I know this? Democratic options yield terrible outcomes. The outcomes were better when we were less democratic.
Let me ask you to clarify. So you say, the more democracy is bad. What should we be doing? How should we be handling these things?
Well, one of the things we should be doing is we should give up the direct election of senators. That's proven to be a terrible thing. Constitutional amendment would be required, as it was a constitutional amendment that got us there in the first place. State legislatures used to pick the Senate representatives from various states. And as a result of the state legislatures choosing, the people they chose cared deeply about the issues of the states.
Yes.
When we moved to direct election of senators, that disappeared. It's really done some damage to the constitutional republic. How do I know this? Well, people who run for Senate, and the idea that you ran for Senate before was ridiculous, right? You were chosen. But the people who run for Senate now, even though they're, I think, a classier bunch on balance than the people who run for the House, and that's, I think, constitutionally prescribed as well. The people who run for the Senate are, in fact, demagogues, just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to separate them from every other politician. There's nothing to hold their feet to the fire. Once upon a time, a state legislature could send you to the Senate. It could take you back from the Senate. And that made a big difference. The other thing that I think has done tremendous difference are primaries. Why on earth are we letting everybody have an opinion about who the candidates should be?
Oh, I see. You're talking about open primaries.
No, primaries, period. I don't think rank and file Republicans should choose the Republican candidate. I don't think Republicans plus independents should choose the Republican candidate. I think the Republican Party should choose it. The party is a private entity. Mm-hmm. And this is equally true of Democrats. I pull Republicans out of the air. It doesn't matter one way or the other. And for those of you out there who are jumping out of your pants, saying something like that's going to lead to an anti-democratic situation, well, yes, definitionally that's true. But when did we get better candidates? Before or after primaries became the way we chose them?
When did primaries become a thing? It had to have been later into the 20th century.
The correct answer to your question is until 1968.
Okay, so correct me then. Prior to that, there was no primary like there is today? You just had party leaders selecting somebody and then you had election day?
It was what everybody refers to as the smoke-filled room, right? And yet we can't have the smoke-filled room because that's anti-democratic. Well, I'm saying we really need the smoke-filled room because it's anti-democratic. Who agrees with me? The founders, the framers of the United States Constitution, who wrote a constitution to limit the democratic element in American politics every single way it could assert itself. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they were terrified of it. They said the more democratic you make this, the more problematic it's going to be and the worse outcomes you will have. I ask you, Ant, did we have worse outcomes before or after 1968?
Just look at the debates.
Well, we didn't have debates until 1960. And then we didn't have another one until 1976. So debates are new too. And they're not debates, those are cartoons. Anything you talk about in American politics, I just asked if it was better or worse prior to 68. And of course, in almost every respect, it's going to be better now. How do I know this? Well, up until the 13th Amendment, we had slavery. Fast forward 100 years after that, you still have race problems that come to the fore in what we euphemistically call the civil rights era. Well, am I going to make the case that things are better then than they were now? No, but I'm only asking a very specific question. Not if everything was better, but if the quality of our candidates was better. And if you think the quality of our political candidates is better now than prior to 1968, I don't know what to tell you. Our presidential candidates now are dreadful, and they've been dreadful for a while.
And I would imagine that's a function of two things. One is you now, as a candidate, have to appeal to the voters at large, and they're not engaged to the level they should be for making the decisions that they're making. The second is you've got to engage with many, many people. Go back to when the Senate was elected by the state legislators. If I'm a senator from Pennsylvania, I'm answering to, I don't know how many legislators Pennsylvania has at the state level, but I'm answering to, 50, 100 people? And that's it.
And you know them, and they know you.
Every one of them. I piss one of them off. It's going to matter. They're going to come back to me. They're going to call me up. They're going to say, look, you need to do things differently. But when I'm elected popularly, there's 20 million people in the state of Pennsylvania? I piss one of them off. What do I care?
And look at how presidential candidates have to run. They have to run to the hard right and the hard left to get anywhere in the primaries.
Yep.
Who votes? The hard right and the hard left. That's what the primaries are. And then they have to become centrists somehow as soon as they win as a hard right or hard left candidate. They have to move to the middle. The news reports this as if it's no big deal. And yet the people who did all the voting are too stupid to realize it's happening. So what are we doing here? Who do we want choosing these people?
But that's how you end up, as we have now, with a fascist against a Marxist. It's two extremes.
I think ultimately that's right. It's World War II all over again, but it's just not playing out the way you would think it would. So I don't know what to say or do about any of this. This is a mess we have made through tinkering with our constitutional structure in the name of making it more reflective of the popular will. Well, now it is more reflective of the popular will, and we find out that the popular will sucks.
Yeah, that wasn't such a good idea.
You go ahead and tell me how I'm wrong. I dare you. Go ahead, I'll wait.
Oh, I don't think you're wrong.
Me and my PhD in political science will just sit over here waiting for this election to happen so we can do it again 4 years hence, and I'll say the same things, and people will do the same things.
But think about a reasonable analogy that if you had a medical problem, would you rather a group of physicians get together and decide what treatment you should get? Or would you like to open it up to a vote to the population at large and let them decide what kind of treatment you want to get? And now, the latter is more democratic, but it comes at the cost of you're bringing people into the decision-making process who have neither skin in the game nor do they have the expertise to make a good, thoughtful decision.
They have no business doing it.
Yeah.
I was watching a focus group on TV today because I guess I just wasn't feeling angry enough already. And some jack said that he was going to vote for Kamala Harris because Taylor Swift told him to. Even if Taylor Swift were a good musician who I loved listening to, I don't give one about who she's voting for. Her expertise is on becoming a country music star at an early teenage point in her life and then becoming a global megastar in the wake of that. That's her expertise. Does she know how to be a surgeon? No. Does she know how to be a baker? No. Does she know anything about politics? No. She knows what her opinion is.
Let me head off a complaint here. And the complaint is, well, you guys are saying all this stuff, and what you're really doing is you're arguing in favor of a dictatorship or an oligarchy.
No.
And that's not it at all. We're arguing for a republic. And the game is, yes, in a republic, the population at large does not vote on the president. You have selected people who vote for or against the president. The population at large elects those people.
You get filtering institutions.
Yes.
That's what we're looking for. What you get if you don't have filtering institutions, that's when you get an oligarch or a fascist. And if you think I'm wrong, explain our two candidates right now. One of whom is saying, more or less, elect me, I'm an oligarch. And the other is saying, more or less, elect me, I'm a fascist. Mm-hmm. You know what I would like to have? I would like to have two people who said, I'm a traditional American who believes in the constitutional republic of these United States, and we're going to implement that, and we're going to live according to set, understood rules, and everybody is going to have the maximum number or amount, however you care to phrase that, of individual rights, and government will be restrained in every way the Constitution says it will be restrained. When's the last time a candidate said that?
James is getting mad.
And it's been 40 years, 45 years since anybody has said that. Before Reagan said it, it had been a long time since anybody had said it then. Mm-hmm. So Reagan, come to find out, was an outlier on this path to oblivion. What's at stake here? It's actually the entire republic. Come to find out, people on the hard left and the hard right are absolutely right. The republic is at stake. They're just wrong about where the problem is. Because the republic is at stake and it will not be saved in this election. Because it cannot be saved in this election. This election is between two people who will damage the constitutional republic even more than it's already damaged, continuing apace the road that we've been on, yea, these many years.
And just because they're damaging it in a way that you might agree with doesn't mean they're not damaging it.
That's right. And the only way off this ledge is to purposefully get off this ledge. Is this the most important election in our lifetime? No. Is this a real problem that we're looking at? Yes. And there's no answer from within the game of this election to solve the problem of this election. So you better start looking outside of this election.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.